The chamber goes silent, and every eye in the room turns to me. I am Elena Ward, junior attaché for the human delegation, and I am standing alone in front of 900 delegates who are laughing at my species. The Kael'thari speaker, a tall figure with silver skin and eyes like cut glass, points a long finger toward the human seating section. His translator device hums before it speaks his words in a flat, mocking tone. "The humans retreat," he says. "They always retreat. They sign papers instead of standing their ground. They apologize instead of answering. Tell me, young attaché, has your species ever finished a fight it started?" I feel my face go hot. I want to answer him. I want to list every reason why patience is not the same as fear, why choosing not to fight is sometimes the harder choice. But my orders are clear. Observe, report. Do not provoke. So I say nothing. The laughter grows louder. Other delegates join in. Species I have never even heard of, creatures with too many eyes or too few limbs, all laughing at the same joke. The joke is us. A representative from the Dravith cluster leans toward her neighbor and says, loud enough for the translators to catch, that humans are the only species in the galaxy who apologize for existing. More laughter. I grip the edge of my podium and keep my eyes forward. The council chair, an old and tired-looking being named Orsa Ven, taps her staff against the floor to bring order back to the room. She does not look at me with cruelty. If anything, there is something like pity in her expression, and that is almost worse. "The vote stands," she announces. Earth's provisional status within the council is downgraded, effective immediately. Humanity will retain observer rights only, until such time as it demonstrates the resolve expected of a spacefaring civilization. I do not argue. I do not raise my voice. I simply nod, gather my notes, and walk out of the chamber with my head high, even though inside I feel like I have swallowed a stone. Outside, in the long glass corridor that overlooks 1,000 ships docked at the council station, I finally let myself breathe. My hands are shaking. Not from fear, from something closer to shame, though I could not yet explain why. A young Dravith aide passes me and does not bother lowering his voice. "Tell your Earth to send someone with a spine next time," he says to his companion, though he clearly means for me to hear it. I keep walking. That night, in my small quarters aboard the station, I record my report for Earth Command. I do not soften the words. I tell them exactly what was said, exactly how we were mocked, exactly how the entire council watched and laughed while humanity stood silent and small. I expect anger. I expect a demand for an apology, or at least a firm rebuttal sent through official channels. Instead, the reply comes back within minutes, shorter than any message I have ever received from command. "Understood. Hold position." That is all it says. No outrage, no plan for a response. Just 4 words that tell me nothing and somehow tell me everything is already decided. I read the message 3 times, trying to find some deeper meaning hidden in it, some clue about what command is thinking. I find nothing, just those 4 words sitting on my screen like a locked door. I do not sleep well that night. I keep replaying the speaker's voice in my head, the way he said, "retreat," like it was a disease. I think about my grandfather, who served during the last great conflict on Earth, and how he never talked about war unless someone asked him directly, and even then, only in careful, measured words. I always thought that was wisdom. Tonight, sitting in a station full of aliens who think we are cowards, I am not so sure anymore what wisdom looks like from the outside. The next morning, I am back in the council chamber for the general session, and the mockery continues, though now it comes wrapped in false politeness. A representative from the Opharan Trade Guild offers to help humanity draft a more respectful set of trade terms, since apparently our previous proposals were too aggressive for a species with no military standing worth mentioning. I sit through it. I take notes. I say nothing that isn't required of me. During the recess, I am approached by an unexpected visitor, Captain Daniel Cross, a human officer I recognize from Earth's small liaison fleet, finds me near the observation deck. He wears his uniform without any of the medals or markings that other species use to signal rank and status. Humans have always kept things simple. I used to think that was another form of restraint. Now I wonder if it was something else entirely. "You held your ground in there," he says, though there was little ground to hold. "I said nothing," I reply. "There was nothing to hold." He studies me for a moment, the way soldiers sometimes look at people who have not yet seen what they have seen. "Sometimes saying nothing is the hardest thing there is," he says. "Get some rest, Elena. Things are going to move quickly soon." I ask him what he means. He only shakes his head and walks away, leaving me standing at the window with 100 more questions than I started with. Over the following days, I notice small things that do not fit the pattern of a species in retreat. The human liaison fleet, usually no more than a handful of transport ships, quietly grows by 2 more vessels, though no announcement is made and no one comments on it. Requests from Earth Command for certain types of technical data increase, but always through private channels, never through the public council registry where other species might notice. I mention this in my nightly reports, more out of curiosity than suspicion. Command's replies remain short, professional, and utterly unrevealing. They thank me for the information. They tell me to continue observing. They give me nothing else. At one point, I try to reach an old contact of mine, a woman named Grace Milton, who works in Earth's Foreign Policy Office. We trained together years ago before our paths split, her toward the political track and mine toward field diplomacy. I send her a personal message, nothing official, just 2 old friends checking in. Her reply takes 2 full days to arrive, and when it does, it is warm but careful, full of pleasant nothing. She asks about my health, about the food on the station, about whether I have made any interesting friends among the other delegations. She says nothing about home. She says nothing about what is happening behind the closed doors of Earth Command. I begin to understand, slowly, painfully, that something has shifted and that I am not being told what it is. 3 weeks after the council session where we were mocked, I am summoned to a private meeting with Ambassador Grace's superior, a stern man named Owen Blake who rarely leaves Earth and almost never travels to the council station in person. His sudden appearance, without any prior notice to the rest of the delegation staff, tells me more than his words ever could. He meets me in a small, windowless room near the human embassy suite, the kind of room reserved for conversations that are not meant to be recorded by station security. He does not sit. He stands with his hands folded behind his back, studying me the way a teacher studies a student before delivering difficult news. "You've done good work here, Elena," he says. "Better than good. Your reports have been thorough, accurate, and honest, even when honesty was not comfortable." I thank him, though I sense there is more coming, something heavier waiting behind his calm tone. "I need you to understand something," he continues. "What happened in that chamber, the laughter, the mockery, the downgrade of our status, none of it was a surprise to Command. We expected it. In some ways, we allowed it." I feel a chill move through me. Allowed it? Why would we allow ourselves to be humiliated in front of the entire council? Owen Blake's expression does not change, but something in his eyes grows harder. "Because a species that everyone underestimates is a species no one prepares for," he says. "For years, Elena, we have let the galaxy believe what it wanted to believe about us. We let them think our restraint was weakness. We let them laugh, and every single day that they laughed, we learned. We watched. We studied every fleet, every weapon system, every political weakness among every major power in this council, and we did it quietly, patiently, while the rest of the galaxy congratulated itself on how harmless we were. I do not know what to say. My mind is racing to catch up with what he is telling me, piecing together the strange fleet movements, the quiet data requests, the careful silence from Command. Are we preparing for something? I ask carefully, or has something already begun? Owen Blake finally allows himself the smallest, coldest smile I have ever seen on a diplomat's face. "Get some rest," he says, echoing the words Captain Cross gave me days earlier. "Things are about to move very quickly." He leaves the room without answering my question directly, but I already know, somewhere deep in my chest, that the answer is both. I return to my quarters that night and sit for a long time without turning on any lights, staring out at the stars beyond the station's thick glass. Somewhere out there, ships are moving. Somewhere out there, decisions are being made that will shape everything that comes next. And for the first time since I arrived at this station, I do not feel humiliated by what was said about my species in that chamber. I feel something else entirely, a quiet, building sense that the laughter we heard was the last mistake this council would ever make about humanity, and that soon, very soon, every single one of them would understand exactly how wrong they had been. The next morning, before my first scheduled meeting, I stopped by the small garden platform near the Embassy District, a quiet space maintained for delegates who need a place to think away from the noise of the chamber. Few people visit it, since most species on this station prefer the busier social corridors where reputations are built and alliances are formed over shared meals. I have always preferred the quiet. I am surprised to find someone already there, a small, elderly being from the Venn Collective, a species so quiet and cautious within the council that I have rarely exchanged more than a formal greeting with any of their representatives. She sits on one of the low benches, tending to a cluster of small blue flowers that seem to be native to neither her world nor mine, watering them carefully from a small metal container. She notices me and offers a slow nod, the closest thing to a smile her species' features seem capable of forming. "You were in the chamber," she says, her translator rendering her voice soft and measured, "during the vote." I admit that I was, bracing myself for another version of the mockery I have grown used to hearing. Instead, she surprises me. "My people do not laugh easily," she says. "We have learned, across many generations, that the quiet ones are often the ones worth watching most carefully. Loud laughter tells you what a room wants to believe. It rarely tells you what is actually true." I ask her what she believes is true about humanity. She considers the question for a long moment before answering, her attention returning briefly to the small flowers in front of her. "I do not know yet," she admits honestly, "but I have learned to be curious about silence, rather than dismissive of it. I would encourage you to remember that not every delegation in that chamber was laughing along with the rest." Her words stay with me long after I leave the garden platform, a small, unexpected kindness in the middle of a difficult week. I do not know if her caution will matter in the end, or if it is simply the quiet instinct of a species that has learned, through its own long history, to be careful about the conclusions it draws too quickly. But it is enough, that morning, to remind me that not every eye in that chamber had been closed to the possibility that we were something more than the joke we had been made to seem. The silence from home does not break. If anything, it deepens. 2 months pass since my meeting with Owen Blake, and life on the council station continues its strange rhythm of insults dressed as diplomacy. I attend session after session, watching other delegations trade barbs about our species whenever the topic of Earth arises, which is often, since our downgraded status makes us an easy target for anyone looking to score political points. I have stopped reacting to it. Not because it no longer stings, but because I have started to see it differently. Every joke made at our expense, every sneer from a Dravith aide, every dismissive wave from the Ophiran Trade Guild feels less like an insult now and more like a countdown. I do not know what we are counting down to. I only know that something is coming and that the galaxy's laughter is about to be interrupted. Captain Daniel Cross becomes a more frequent presence in my life during these weeks, though never in any official capacity. He finds reasons to be near the embassy, always with some small excuse, a delivery to check, a security sweep to perform, a routine inspection that never seems to end quickly. I begin to suspect he has been assigned to watch over me, though neither of us says this directly. One evening, As I am reviewing transcripts from the day's session, he appears at my door with 2 cups of something warm that smells faintly of cinnamon. He does not ask if he can come in. He simply waits, and I let him inside, grateful for the company after another day of quiet humiliation. "You look tired," he says, setting one of the cups on my desk. "I look like someone who has spent 2 months being told her species is a joke," I reply. Tired doesn't begin to cover it. He sits across from me, turning his own cup slowly in his hands. "It won't be much longer," he says. I have learned not to ask him directly what he means, because he never answers, not fully. Instead, I ask a different question, one I have been turning over in my mind since my meeting with Owen Blake. "Daniel, how long has this been planned? The watching, the studying, all of it. How long has Command known this moment was coming?" He is quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with the same care I have come to expect from every human officer I have met on this station. "Longer than you'd think," he finally says. "Long before either of us were assigned here." This isn't a plan that started with the Kael'thari speaker's insult. That was just the moment the rest of the galaxy decided to say out loud what they had already been thinking for years. I ask him what he means by that. "They've always underestimated us," he says, "every species in this council. They see our history, the wars we stopped before they spread across the stars, the treaties we signed instead of the battles we could have fought, and they assume it means we are afraid. What they never bothered to ask is why a species capable of building ships that can cross a galaxy would choose restraint so often. They assumed the answer was fear. They never once considered the answer might be patience." I think about my grandfather again, about the quiet way he spoke of his own service, never boasting, never dwelling, simply carrying the weight of it without complaint. I always saw that as something small and private. Now, sitting across from Daniel Cross, I begin to wonder if that same quiet has been present in every part of my species' behavior on the galactic stage, hidden in plain sight the entire time. Over the following weeks, I begin noticing more signs, small pieces of a larger picture slowly assembling themselves in front of me. Trade requests from Earth to several border colonies increase sharply, though always framed as routine commerce. A number of human engineers who once worked openly on civilian station projects quietly transfer to postings that are never publicly listed. My own access to certain communication channels, previously unrestricted, becomes limited without explanation. I raise these concerns in my nightly reports, and for the first time, Command's replies begin to shift in tone, though only slightly. Instead of simple acknowledgments, I start receiving brief instructions. "Continue your normal duties. Avoid drawing attention to any unusual activity you observe. Trust the process. Trust the process." The phrase repeats in my mind long after I read it, and I find myself wondering exactly what kind of process requires this much secrecy from its own diplomatic staff. A turning point arrives during a routine council session focused on border security along a contested stretch of space near the Kael'thari Compact's outer colonies. The session should have been dull, filled with the usual back and forth between rival trade powers arguing over shipping lanes and resource rights. Instead, it becomes something else entirely. A representative from a smaller species called the Venn Collective, usually quiet and cautious in these sessions, requests to address the chamber on an urgent matter. The council chair grants permission, and the Venn representative, a slight being with pale blue markings across her face, begins describing a series of disappearances along one of the Kael'thari border colonies. Entire settlements, she claims, have gone silent over the past several days. Communications cut off, supply ships unaccounted for. When Kael'thari patrol vessels investigated, they found the colonies emptied, with no signs of struggle and no explanation for where the inhabitants had gone. The chamber erupts into murmurs. The Kael'thari speaker rises immediately, his silver skin flushed with something close to anger, denying any knowledge of the incident and accusing the Venn representative of spreading unfounded rumors meant to destabilize trade relations. But I notice something in his voice, a tightness that was not present during his earlier mockery of humanity. Fear, perhaps, or confusion. Either way, it is clear that whatever happened at those colonies was not something the Kael'thari themselves fully understand. I glance toward the small human observation section where Ambassador Grace Milton sits with unreadable calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She does not react to the news the way the rest of the chamber does. She simply watches, quiet and composed, and for the first time, I begin to suspect that whatever is happening along that border is not a mystery to everyone in this room. After the session ends, I approach her directly, breaking protocol in a way I rarely allow myself to do. "Ambassador," I say quietly, "do we know something about what happened at those colonies?" She studies me for a long moment before answering, and when she does, her voice carries none of the warmth I remember from our earlier, easier days working together. "Elena, I need you to trust that everything happening right now is happening for a reason. I know it is difficult not knowing the full picture. I promise you, the full picture is coming. It is not the answer I want, but it is the only one I receive." That night, I cannot sleep. I sit by my window, watching the distant lights of docked ships, wondering how many of them belong to human vessels I have never been told about, moving quietly through the dark, while the rest of the galaxy remains focused on its usual squabbles and rivalries. 2 days later, the tension in the council reaches a new height when a second colony reports the same strange silence. This time, the colony belongs not to the Kael'thari, but to the Ophiran Trade Guild, one of the loudest voices in mocking humanity's supposed cowardice during that first fateful session. Panic spreads quickly through the chamber. Delegates who once laughed together now eye one another with open suspicion, each species wondering if their neighbors are somehow responsible for the disappearances. Through it all, the human delegation remains eerily calm. We attend every session. We participate in every discussion. We offer no theories, no accusations, no panic of our own. Our silence, once mocked as weakness, now draws confused glances from delegations who clearly do not know what to make of it. I find Captain Cross again on the observation deck one evening, staring out at the stars with an expression I cannot quite read. "You know what's happening out there," I say. It is not a question. He does not deny it. "I know pieces," he admits. "Enough to understand that everything is moving exactly as it was planned to move." "Is anyone in danger?" I ask. "The people from those colonies, are they safe?" He turns to look at me, and for the first time since I have known him, I see something like genuine sympathy in his expression. "Nobody who didn't choose to stand against us will be harmed," he says carefully. "That's all I can tell you right now, Elena. But I need you to hold on just a little longer. Everything is about to become clear." I want to press him further, but something in his tone tells me this is as much as he is willing to share. I let the silence settle between us, watching the stars together, both of us waiting for whatever comes next. 3 days after that conversation, an emergency notice arrives through official council channels, requesting an immediate special session, called not by any of the usual major powers, but by the human delegation itself. The notice spreads through the station like wildfire, whispered from one embassy to another, delegates gathering in hallways to speculate about what could possibly justify humanity requesting a session of its own, given our reduced status within the council. I receive my own instructions from Ambassador Grace Milton late that night, delivered in person rather than through any recorded channel. She finds me in my quarters, calm as ever, and tells me only that I am to attend the session in full formal dress, seated in the front row of the human delegation, and that I am not to speak unless directly addressed. "What is happening tomorrow?" I ask her, though I already suspect I will not receive a full answer. She studies me for a long moment, and for the first time in weeks, something like warmth returns to her expression, mixed with something else I cannot quite name. Pride, perhaps, or resolve. "Tomorrow," she says quietly, "the galaxy finds out exactly what patience has been building toward." She leaves without another word, and I spend the rest of the night staring at the ceiling of my quarters, unable to sleep, unable to stop replaying every strange event of the past months, every quiet clue now clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle I never fully understood until this very moment. Whatever is coming, I realize, is no longer a secret being kept from the galaxy by accident. It is a secret about to be revealed on humanity's own terms, in humanity's own time, exactly as it seems we have always intended. Before sleep finally takes me, I find myself thinking of the small Ven representative from the garden platform, the quiet caution she carried in her voice when she spoke about laughter, revealing what a room wants to believe rather than what is actually true. I wonder if she has noticed the same signs I have, the strange silences, the sudden absence of certain ships from the docking registry, the careful way our delegation has stopped reacting to insults that once would have stung far more deeply. I decide, on a small impulse, to seek her out again the following afternoon. I find her in the same garden platform, tending the same small blue flowers, as though she has not moved since our last conversation. "You look troubled," she says, without looking up from her work. "I think something large is coming," I admit. "I do not know exactly what, but I can feel the shape of it, even if I cannot see it clearly yet." She nods slowly, setting down her small watering container. "My people have a saying," she tells me. "The quietest storm carries the heaviest rain. I have watched your delegation for many months now, Elena Ward. I do not believe your species has been retreating from anything. I believe you have been waiting." I ask her what she thinks we have been waiting for. She considers the question with the same careful patience she brings to everything. "For the rest of us to finish underestimating you," she says. "I suspect that moment is close. I would advise you to be ready for it, whatever shape it finally takes." Her words unsettle me more than any mockery ever could, not because they carry any cruelty, but because they carry the quiet certainty of someone who has spent a very long life learning to read the signs others overlook. I thank her for her honesty and return to my quarters with even more questions circling through my mind than before. 2 days later, the emergency notice arrives, calling the special session that will change everything. I think of her words again as I dress in the formal attire Ambassador Grace Milton instructed me to wear, wondering if the small, cautious delegation of the Ven Collective will be the only one in that chamber who does not appear completely blindsided by what is about to unfold. The chamber has never been this full. Every seat is occupied, every balcony crowded with aides and observers who normally would not bother attending a session called by a species with reduced standing. Word of the emergency request has traveled across the entire station, and it seems every delegation in the council wants to witness whatever explanation humanity intends to offer. I sit in the front row of the human section, wearing the formal dress Ambassador Grace Milton instructed me to wear, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. Beside me sits Captain Daniel Cross, standing straight and still, his eyes fixed forward with the calm of someone who already knows exactly what is about to happen. The council chair, Orsa Ven, calls the session to order, her staff striking the floor 3 times before the chamber finally quiets. She looks toward our section with an expression of genuine curiosity, perhaps even concern, and invites Ambassador Grace Milton to step forward and address the assembly. Grace rises slowly, smoothing the front of her formal jacket, and walks to the center platform with a steadiness that silences even the last murmurs of conversation drifting through the balconies. She does not look nervous. She does not look uncertain. She looks like someone who has waited a very long time for this exact moment. "Honored members of the council," she begins, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the vast chamber without any need for amplification. "Several months ago, this body openly mocked humanity for what it called our cowardice. We were told we retreat instead of standing our ground. We were told we apologize instead of answering. Our status within this council was downgraded as a result, and many of you laughed as that decision was made." A few uncomfortable shifts ripple through the audience, though no one interrupts her. I want you to know, she continues, that we heard every word of that mockery. We understood exactly what was being said about us, and we chose not to respond in that moment, not because we lacked the resolve to answer, but because we were not yet ready to answer in the way that mattered. The chamber grows very still. Over these past months, Grace continues, several of you have reported strange disappearances along your border colonies, communications going silent, supply ships vanishing, settlements found empty with no explanation. I imagine many of you have spent these weeks searching for someone to blame, some hidden enemy responsible for these events. She pauses, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the tension in the room to become unbearable. I am here today to tell you the truth, she says. Those colonies did not vanish by accident. They were evacuated, deliberately and carefully, by human forces, as part of a long-planned response to hostile actions taken against Earth and its allies by certain members of this council. The chamber explodes into noise. Delegates rise from their seats, voices overlapping in dozens of different languages, translators struggling to keep pace with the sudden chaos. The Kael'thari speaker is on his feet immediately, his silver skin flushed dark with fury, shouting something about violation of council law before his translator even finishes catching up with his words. Orsa Ven strikes her staff against the floor again and again, demanding order, and it takes nearly a full minute before the chamber settles enough for Grace to continue. Let me be clear, Grace says, her voice never rising, never wavering, even as the room around her had been consumed by panic just moments before. No one from those colonies has been harmed. Every evacuated civilian is alive, unharmed, and currently under the protection of Earth forces. This was not an act of aggression against innocent people. It was a necessary step in a larger operation, one made necessary by actions taken against human interests that this council chose to ignore. The Kael'thari speaker demands to know what actions she is referring to, his voice sharp with barely controlled anger. Grace turns to face him directly, and for the first time, something steel-edged enters her tone. For the past 3 years, she says, Kael'thari-backed forces have conducted repeated incursions into human-protected trade routes along the outer colonies, seizing cargo, disabling civilian vessels, and in several documented cases, causing the deaths of human crew members. Every formal complaint filed by Earth through proper council channels was dismissed, delayed, or quietly buried by representatives sympathetic to Kael'thari trade interests. We have the records, we have the evidence, and we have waited, patiently, for this council to address these violations through legitimate means. She lets that sit in the silence for a long moment before continuing. That patience, she says, has run out. The speaker begins to protest again, but Grace raises a hand, and something in the simple gesture, calm and unhurried, silences him more effectively than any shout could have. Effective immediately, she continues, Earth and its allied colonies are formally declaring a state of war against the Kael'thari Compact, and against any council member who continues to provide material or political support to Kael'thari forces following this declaration. The word war lands in the chamber like a physical blow. I feel the room shift around me, hundreds of delegates frozen in the same stunned silence I remember from that first session, when the speaker mocked our supposed cowardice and the entire chamber laughed along with him. No one is laughing now. Grace continues, her voice steady, reciting details with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment countless times. She lists specific coordinates along the border where human forces have already secured strategic positions. She lists timestamps marking when certain operations began, some of them, I realize with a jolt, dating back months before that very first insult in this chamber. She lists the terms under which the conflict could be resolved, terms that are firm but not cruel, offering the Kael'thari Compact a path toward negotiated peace should they choose to accept accountability for their actions. Throughout it all, there is no shouting, no threats, no dramatic display of anger, just calm, Methodical information, delivered with the same quiet steadiness my grandfather used to describe when he spoke, rarely, about difficult decisions made during difficult times. When she finishes, the chamber remains silent for what feels like a very long time. Even the translators seem to hesitate before finishing their final lines of interpretation, as though even artificial intelligence needs a moment to process the shift that has just occurred. The Kalthari speaker finally breaks the silence, his voice quieter now, stripped of the arrogance that filled it during our first encounter. "You cannot simply declare war on a council power," he says. "You have no standing. Your status was downgraded. You have no military presence recognized by this body." Grace's expression does not change. "Our status within this council," she says, "was never the source of our strength. It never has been. You mocked us for retreating, for apologizing, for choosing peace over conflict, and you assumed that meant we lacked the capacity to fight. What you failed to understand is that every choice to avoid conflict was exactly that, a choice, made deliberately, by a species fully capable of doing what we are about to do now." She turns, addressing the wider chamber rather than the speaker alone. "For generations, this council has watched humanity and drawn its own conclusions about what our patience meant. You called it weakness. You called it cowardice. I am telling you now, in front of every delegation present, that what you witnessed was never weakness. It was restraint, chosen deliberately, maintained deliberately, and now, finally, set aside deliberately, because restraint that is mistaken for permission stops serving any purpose at all." I watch faces across the chamber cycle through disbelief, confusion, and something that looks very much like fear. Species who spent months mocking us now sit in stunned silence, recalculating everything they thought they understood about the quiet species from the small blue world at the edge of council space. Orsa Ven, still processing the enormity of what has just been declared, finally finds her voice. "This council cannot simply allow a declaration of war to be made without formal review," she says, though even her authority sounds shaken in this moment. Grace nods respectfully. "We understand this council's processes, and we respect them, but council law also recognizes the right of any member species to declare formal conflict in response to sustained, documented violations of trade and territorial agreements, provided evidence is presented. That evidence has been formally submitted to this chamber's archive as of this morning, available for immediate review by any delegation present." A representative from a neutral trade coalition, seated several rows behind the Kalthari section, requests permission to speak. Orsa Ven grants it, clearly grateful for any voice that might help stabilize the chaos still rippling through the room. The representative, a calm and measured being from a species I do not immediately recognize, asks a simple but pointed question. "If your evidence is legitimate, why did you not present it sooner? Why allow this council to continue believing incorrect assumptions about your intentions for so long?" Grace considers the question carefully before answering. "Because presenting evidence to a body that had already decided, through ridicule and dismissal, that our concerns were not worth taking seriously would have accomplished nothing," she says. "We needed this council, and every species within it, to understand fully and completely what our patience was truly capable of holding back. Words alone would not have accomplished that understanding. Actions were required." The chamber falls into a different kind of silence now, less chaotic, more contemplative, as delegates begin to grapple with the shift that has just occurred in the balance of power across the entire council. Captain Cross leans slightly toward me, his voice barely a whisper beneath the murmur still rippling through the room. "This is only the beginning," he says. "What happens next will move faster than anyone in this chamber is prepared for." I ask him quietly how he can be so certain. He gives me a small, tired smile, the kind of smile worn by someone who has spent years carrying knowledge they were not yet permitted to share. "Because we've been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time," he says, "and preparation, when it finally meets its purpose, does not hesitate. Before the session fully dissolves into scattered conversation, a small voice requests recognition from the far side of the chamber, easy to overlook among the louder, more dramatic reactions still rippling through the room. WarHFY grants permission, and I recognize the speaker immediately, the small, careful representative of the Venn collective, rising slowly from her seat. "I would like the record to reflect," she says, her translator rendering her voice as calm and measured as it had been during our quiet conversation on the garden platform, "that my delegation does not share the shock apparently felt by others in this chamber. We have observed the human delegation carefully for a considerable time. Their patience was never a mystery to those willing to look past the surface of it." A few scattered murmurs follow her statement, some dismissive, others thoughtful, but I feel a small, unexpected warmth at her words, a quiet vindication of the caution she shared with me days earlier. Grace Milton, still standing at the center platform, offers the Venn representative a small, grateful nod before continuing to field questions from the rest of the assembly. A representative from a distant trade coalition asks whether other council members should now consider their own past dealings with humanity in a different light, worried aloud that other unresolved grievances might similarly be answered with sudden, decisive action rather than further negotiation. Grace addresses the concern directly, her tone firm but not unkind. "This council has no reason to fear escalation from Earth, provided legitimate grievances continue to be addressed through legitimate means," she says. "What ends today is not our willingness to negotiate. What ends today is any assumption that negotiation can be endlessly delayed, dismissed, or mocked without consequence. We remain willing partners to any species prepared to deal with us honestly." Her answer seems to calm some of the anxious energy still moving through the chamber, though plenty of uncertainty remains etched across the faces of delegates who spent months treating humanity's patience as an open invitation for disrespect. A younger delegate from the Ophiran Trade Guild, seated close enough that I can see the discomfort plainly written across her features, raises a hand and asks a question that seems to carry genuine confusion rather than hostility. "How were we meant to know," she asks, "that your restraint carried this much weight behind it? Every signal your species gave us suggested caution, even hesitation. Nothing suggested a campaign of this scale had been building beneath the surface." Grace considers the question carefully, and when she answers, her tone carries none of the sharpness she showed earlier toward the Kael'thari speaker. "That is a fair question," she says, "and I do not think you are alone in asking it. Perhaps the lesson here is not simply about humanity, but about the danger of assuming that quiet behavior always means the same thing across every species you encounter. Silence can mean many things. Weakness is only one of them, and in our case, it was never the correct one." The young delegate nods slowly, clearly turning the answer over in her mind, and takes her seat without further comment. I notice several other delegates around the chamber doing the same, an unusual quiet settling over a room that had been filled with noise and confusion only minutes earlier. Captain Cross leans toward me again, his voice low. "Watch this moment carefully, Elena," he says. "This is the part of the story that matters just as much as the fighting. This is where understanding actually begins to change." The Kael'thari speaker attempts one final protest, insisting that the evidence presented against his compact requires independent verification before any formal state of conflict can be recognized by council law. WarHFY, regaining some of her composure, agrees that a formal review process will proceed alongside the declared conflict, though she notes plainly that Earth's right to respond to documented aggression is not contingent on the completion of that review. "The review may determine the precise scope of reparations owed," she says, "but it will not undo actions already taken in legitimate defense of established grievances. I would advise the Kael'thari delegation to prepare accordingly." It is as close to an official rebuke as I have ever heard the council chair deliver, and the speaker's expression falls further as the weight of her words settles over him. The session ends without any formal resolution, the council too fractured and stunned to reach any unified response. Delegations scatter into smaller groups throughout the chamber, whispering among themselves, some already distancing themselves from any public association with the Kael'thari Compact, clearly unwilling to be caught on the losing side of whatever comes next. As I leave the chamber alongside Captain Cross, I glance back one final time and see the Kael'thari speaker still standing near his seat, staring at nothing in particular, his earlier fury replaced entirely by something that looks a great deal like fear. I think back to that first session, to his mocking words about humanity's cowardice, to the laughter that filled this same chamber while I stood alone and silent, unable to defend my own species. I think about how much has changed in the months since that day, how much I did not know, how much was happening quietly behind every closed door while the rest of the galaxy congratulated itself on how harmless we seemed. Outside the chamber, the station corridors buzz with nervous energy, delegates from a dozen species moving quickly toward their embassies, already drafting messages to send home about the extraordinary events they have just witnessed. For the first time since I arrived at this station, no one bothers looking twice at the human delegation as we pass. No mocking glances, no whispered jokes, just careful, uncertain silence. I do not know exactly what the coming days will bring, but I understand, with a clarity I have never felt before, that the galaxy's laughter has finally, completely, come to an end. Within a week, everything about my role at the council station changes. I am reassigned from diplomatic observation to a liaison position aboard a human command vessel called the Meridian, stationed just beyond the contested border where the disappearances first began. Ambassador Grace Milton tells me the reassignment comes directly from Owen Blake, who apparently believes my understanding of council politics will prove useful now that the conflict has moved from words into action. I leave the station with very little warning, packing only what I need before boarding a transport ship bound for the border region. Captain Daniel Cross travels with me, finally free to speak openly about matters he had spent months only hinting at during our quiet conversations on the observation deck. "You'll see things differently once we're out there," he tells me as our transport clears the station's docking bay. It's easy to imagine what a conflict like this looks like from behind a podium in a council chamber. It looks very different from the deck of a command vessel. I ask him what I should expect. He considers the question carefully before answering. "Precision," he finally says. "That's the word I'd use. Everything happening out there has been planned, rehearsed, and refined for years. Nothing about what you're going to see is chaotic, even though I imagine some of it will look that way at first." He is right. Nothing prepares me for the sheer scale of coordination I witness once I arrive aboard the Meridian. The command deck hums with quiet efficiency, officers moving between stations with practiced calm, exchanging updates in clipped, precise language that leaves no room for confusion. Admiral Owen Blake himself oversees operations from a central platform, watching a massive holographic display that maps the entire border region in real time, showing fleet positions, supply lines, and projected enemy movements updating continuously as new information arrives. I stand near the edge of the command deck, trying to absorb the enormity of what I am witnessing, while Captain Cross explains pieces of the strategy unfolding in front of me. The Kael'thari Compact built its entire border defense around the assumption that any conflict with us would follow the same slow, hesitant pattern as every previous human engagement, he says. Small skirmishes, cautious advances, long negotiations before any real commitment to force. Their entire doctrine depends on that assumption. And it's wrong, I say, beginning to understand. Completely wrong, he confirms. We spent years studying their fleet movements, their political weaknesses, the rivalries between their border commanders and their central government. We know exactly where their defenses are strongest and exactly where they are weakest because we've been watching quietly for longer than most of their current commanders have held their positions. Over the following days, I watched this understanding play out with startling speed. Reports arrive from across the border region describing Kael'thari defensive lines collapsing far faster than seems possible, not through overwhelming force, but through precise, coordinated strikes aimed at exact points of weakness identified long before the first shot of this conflict was ever fired. I ask Admiral Blake directly, during one of the rare quiet moments on the command deck, how humanity managed to gather so much information without the Kael'thari ever noticing. He studies me for a long moment before answering, the same careful, measuring look I remember from our first meeting back on the council station. Every trade agreement we ever signed with a neutral party who also dealt with the Kael'thari gave us small pieces of information, he says. Every diplomatic mission we sent, even the ones that seemed to accomplish nothing, gathered fragments of data about their infrastructure and their command structure. We were patient, Elena. We have always been patient. The galaxy simply never understood what our patience was building toward. I think about my early reports from the council station, the ones filled with mockery and humiliation, and I realize now that even those humiliating sessions likely served a purpose, allowing our observers to study exactly how each species reacted under pressure, exactly which delegations aligned themselves with Kael'thari interests, exactly where the fractures in this galaxy's political structure could be found. The conflict does not unfold as a single dramatic battle, but as a careful, methodical campaign, each move building on the last, each Kael'thari response anticipated and countered before it can fully develop. Within the first 2 weeks, 3 major border colonies fall under human control, their local populations, I am relieved to learn, treated with careful restraint and offered protection rather than punishment. I am given the chance to witness one of these transitions firsthand when Admiral Blake authorizes a small liaison team, myself included, to accompany a transport heading toward one of the newly secured colonies. The settlement, a modest mining community that had operated under Kael'thari administration for decades, sits quiet beneath a pale orange sky when our shuttle finally touches down. I expect fear among the local population, or at the very least, deep suspicion toward the human officers now walking through their streets. What I find instead is a cautious, uncertain curiosity. Families gather near their doorways, watching as human medical teams move from building to building, offering supplies and checking on anyone who requires assistance. Children peer out from behind their parents, more curious than afraid, watching the strange new arrivals with wide, careful eyes. A local administrator, an older woman named Odile Farrow, who had lived under Kael'thari oversight for most of her life, approaches our group hesitantly. She introduces herself through a translator device clipped to her collar, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who has spent weeks unsure what the future holds for her community. "We were told humans would come to punish us for our compact's decisions," she says. "That you would take everything and leave us with nothing." Captain Cross, standing beside me, answers her directly. "We're not here to punish anyone who wasn't responsible for the decisions that led to this conflict," he says. "Your community will keep its resources, its governance, and its safety. What changes is who you answer to when it comes to trade and border security." Odile studies him for a long moment, clearly searching for some hidden catch in his words. When she finds none, something in her posture finally begins to ease. "The compact told us many things about your kind," she admits. "I am beginning to suspect very little of it was true. I think of the mocking laughter that once filled the council chamber, the confident assumption that humanity's restraint meant we lacked the will to act decisively when action finally became necessary. Standing in this quiet, uncertain colony, watching human officers work carefully to reassure a frightened population rather than exploit their vulnerability, I understand more clearly than ever how completely that assumption failed to capture the truth of who we actually are." Before we leave the colony, Odile asks one final question, one that lingers with me long after our shuttle lifts back into the pale orange sky. Will this happen to every colony along the border, she asks, or only the ones where the compact chose violence over negotiation? Captain Cross answers her honestly. That depends entirely on choices being made far above either of our positions, he says. But I can promise you this: it will never depend on the color of anyone's sky or the shape of anyone's hands, only on whether peace remains possible. News of these developments spreads quickly through the wider council, and the political fallout proves nearly as significant as the military campaign itself. Species who once eagerly aligned themselves with Kael'thari trade interests now scramble to distance themselves, fearful of being associated with a power clearly losing ground against an enemy they once dismissed as harmless. I follow these political shifts closely through updates relayed from Ambassador Grace Milton, who remains behind at the council station managing the diplomatic side of the growing conflict. Her messages describe a council in disarray, delegations quietly reaching out to establish separate communication with Earth, hoping to secure favorable trade terms before the conflict resolves in humanity's favor. Aboard the Meridian, I find myself increasingly drawn into direct discussions about the ongoing campaign, my understanding of council politics proving useful exactly as Owen Blake predicted. During one strategy session, I am asked to review recent council communications for any signs of shifting alliances among neutral species, information that could prove critical in determining where human forces might expect additional resistance or unexpected support. It is strange, sitting in a room full of military officers, contributing to decisions that carry such enormous weight, after spending months feeling powerless within the council chamber. I find myself thinking often about that first humiliating session, about the speaker's mocking words, about the laughter that filled the room while I stood silent and unable to respond. I wonder if he has heard yet about the colonies falling one after another along his own compact's border. I wonder if he still believes humanity retreats instead of standing its ground. During a quiet moment between briefings, Captain Cross finds me reviewing reports near the observation window, watching distant flashes of light mark the edges of ongoing engagements far beyond where the Meridian holds its position. "You've been quiet," he says, settling into the seat beside me. "I keep thinking about everyone back on the station," I admit. "The delegations who mocked us, who laughed at us. I wonder what they're thinking now, watching everything unfold exactly as we intended." He considers this for a moment, before responding. "I imagine a lot of them are thinking the same thing you were thinking during that first session," he says, "wondering how they misjudged us so completely. Wondering what else they got wrong." He tells me, too, about the long nights spent aboard supply vessels years before the conflict ever became public, quietly mapping shipping lanes that would later prove critical to the campaign's success. He describes engineers who spent entire careers building instruments no one outside a small circle of command staff ever knew existed, and officers who trained for engagements they were told might never actually happen. None of them, he says, ever complained about the uncertainty. They simply trusted that the patience being asked of them served a purpose larger than any of them could see individually. "That's the part people forget," he says. "When they talk about strength, they usually picture a single dramatic moment, a battle, a declaration. What they don't see is the years of ordinary people quietly doing difficult, unglamorous work, trusting a plan they were never given the full picture of, simply because they believed in why it mattered." I ask him whether he ever doubted this plan, whether the years of quiet preparation ever felt uncertain or fragile. He is honest with me, more honest than I expect. "There were moments," he admits, "watching delegation after delegation mock us, year after year, wondering if all our patience would simply be mistaken for permanent weakness rather than strength. But command never wavered, not once, and that certainty made it easier for the rest of us to hold our own resolve, even during the hardest moments." 3 weeks into the campaign, a significant turning point arrives. The Kael'thari central government, facing mounting losses along its border and increasing political isolation within the wider council, requests formal negotiations through neutral intermediaries. Admiral Blake receives the request with the same calm precision he has shown throughout the entire campaign, neither celebrating prematurely nor dismissing the possibility of a resolution. "They're not ready to surrender," he tells the assembled command staff during a briefing I am permitted to attend, "but they're beginning to understand that continuing this conflict on their current terms will only cost them more than they're prepared to lose." That understanding is exactly what we've been working toward from the very beginning. I ask him what comes next, now that negotiations have entered the conversation. He looks at the holographic display still tracking fleet positions across the border region, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Now," he says, "we make certain that whatever agreement comes out of these negotiations reflects the full truth of what happened here. Not a version softened to protect wounded pride. Not a story rewritten to make anyone feel better about how badly they misjudged us. The truth, plainly stated, so that no council power ever makes this same mistake again." Over the following days, negotiations begin slowly, cautiously, conducted through careful diplomatic channels, while military operations continue at a reduced but steady pace, maintaining pressure without escalating unnecessarily. I find myself once again drawn into diplomatic work, this time helping draft communications intended to ensure that whatever terms emerge from these talks fully reflect the reality of what humanity endured leading up to this conflict, and fully reflect the reality of what humanity is truly capable of when patience finally reaches its limit. Through it all, I think often about the strange journey that brought me here, from a humiliated junior attaché standing silent in a mocking chamber, to a liaison officer helping shape the terms of a conflict that is rapidly reshaping the entire balance of power across known space. I think about how easily the galaxy mistook our silence for weakness, and how completely that mistake is now being corrected, not through cruelty or excessive force, but through patient, deliberate precision, exactly as it was always intended to unfold. As the meridian holds its position along the shifting front, I watch the distant lights of ongoing engagements slowly begin to quiet, replaced by the steadier glow of negotiation channels opening between human command and increasingly desperate Kelthari representatives. Whatever comes next, I understand now with complete certainty that the galaxy's understanding of humanity has changed forever, and that there is no returning to the mocking laughter that once filled that council chamber so easily. 6 weeks after the war began, I returned to the council station for the first time since the fighting started. The station looks the same on the surface, the same wide corridors, the same busy embassies filled with delegates from 100 different species. But something in the atmosphere has shifted so completely that I barely recognize the place I once walked through as an overlooked junior attaché. Delegates who once ignored me now nod respectfully as I pass. Aides who once whispered mocking jokes about humanity's supposed cowardice now avoid meeting my eyes entirely. The change is subtle in some ways and impossible to miss in others, and I find myself needing several days simply to adjust to how differently I am treated within these same familiar walls. Ambassador Grace Milton meets me shortly after my arrival, looking tired but satisfied, the weight of months of careful diplomatic maneuvering finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. She tells me the formal peace negotiations with the Kelthari Compact have reached their final stage, and that a special session has been called to finalize the terms in front of the full council. "You should be there," she tells me. "After everything you witnessed from the very beginning, it seems right that you see how this chapter closes." I accept without hesitation, and 2 days later, I find myself once again standing in the same grand chamber where this entire story began, though everything about how I enter that room feels different this time. The chamber is just as full as it was during our declaration of war. Delegates from every corner of council space gathered to witness the formal conclusion of a conflict that has reshaped assumptions across the entire galaxy. I take my seat, no longer in the overlooked junior section, but among the senior members of the human delegation, a change in seating that speaks volumes about how thoroughly our standing within this council has been restored. WarHFY opens the session with a formality that carries none of the pity I once saw in her expression during our earlier, humiliating encounter. She invites representatives from both Earth and the Kalthari Compact to present the finalized terms of peace before the full assembly. A Kalthari representative I do not recognize, someone clearly appointed to replace the speaker who once mocked us so openly, rises first. His voice is careful, measured, stripped of any arrogance, as he outlines the terms his government has agreed to accept. Reparations for the trade route violations that sparked the conflict. Formal acknowledgement of the incursions that caused the deaths of human crew members years earlier. A binding agreement to respect human-protected territory along the contested border, enforced through mechanisms overseen jointly by Earth and neutral council observers. I watch his face as he speaks, searching for any trace of the defiance that once filled the speaker's voice, and find none. Whatever pride remained within the Kalthari Compact has been thoroughly humbled by the outcome of this conflict. Ambassador Grace Milton rises next, and her voice, calm and steady as always, carries none of the triumph one might expect from the winning side of such a significant conflict. Instead, she speaks with the same measured restraint that has defined humanity's presence within this council from the very beginning, even through all the mockery and misunderstanding that once surrounded us. Earth accepts these terms, she says, not out of any desire for continued conflict, but because these terms finally reflect the truth that this council refused to acknowledge when we first raised our concerns through proper channels. We did not seek this war. We sought only fairness, respect, and accountability. When those things were denied to us repeatedly, we were left with no choice but to demonstrate, clearly and unmistakably, exactly what our patience had been protecting this council from experiencing. A murmur ripples through the chamber, though this time it carries none of the mocking energy from that first session. It is something closer to respect, mixed with lingering uncertainty about how completely the galaxy's understanding of humanity has been rewritten. Grace continues, addressing the wider assembly rather than the Kalthari representative alone. I want to be clear about something. For every delegation present in this chamber today, humanity did not become a different species over these past months. We did not suddenly discover strength we never possessed. What changed was your understanding of us, corrected through actions we hoped, for a very long time, would never become necessary. She pauses, letting her words settle across the silent chamber. We have always valued peace, she says. That has never changed, and it never will. But peace maintained through mockery, through dismissal, through the assumption that our restraint could be exploited without consequence, was never true peace at all. It was simply conflict deferred, waiting for a moment when patience finally reached its natural limit. The chamber remains quiet for a long moment after she finishes, the weight of her words settling over delegates who, only months earlier, had laughed freely at the idea of humanity ever standing its ground. WarHFY finally breaks the silence, formally accepting the terms of peace on behalf of the Council, and with that acceptance, the war that began with mockery in this very chamber comes to its official close. As the session moves toward its conclusion, something unexpected happens. A representative from the Ophiran Trade Guild, one of the delegations that had once joined enthusiastically in mocking humanity during that first fateful session, requests permission to address the chamber. WarHFY grants it, and the representative rises with visible discomfort, clearly aware of how her words months earlier now stand in stark contrast to the reality of what has unfolded since. I want to formally acknowledge, she says, her voice careful and measured, that the Ophiran Trade Guild misjudged humanity's character and capabilities. We allowed assumptions built on incomplete understanding to shape our treatment of a council member deserving of far greater respect than we offered. We hope, in time, to rebuild the trust our earlier judgment damaged. It is not a full apology, not exactly, but it is close enough that I feel something loosen in my chest, some lingering tension I did not realize I had been carrying since that very first humiliating session. Grace accepts the acknowledgement gracefully, without any trace of lingering resentment, exactly as I expect from someone who has spent her entire career prioritizing long-term stability over short-term satisfaction. After the session ends, delegations from across the chamber approach the human section with a level of interest and respect I have never witnessed during my time on this station. Trade representatives request private meetings to discuss new agreements. Smaller species, who once kept careful distance from humanity, wary of associating with a delegation the larger powers dismissed so easily, now seek closer alliances, clearly hoping to align themselves favorably with a power whose true strength the entire galaxy has finally come to understand. Before I make my way to the observation window, I catch sight of a familiar figure near the edge of the chamber, moving slowly through the dispersing crowd. The small, careful representative of the Venn Collective stands quietly near one of the tall support columns, watching the same scene of shifting alliances and cautious respect that I have been observing myself. I approach her, unable to resist the urge to thank her properly for the small kindness she offered me on the garden platform so many months earlier. "Your words stayed with me," I tell her, "through all of it. The waiting, the uncertainty, even the fighting. I wanted you to know that." She regards me with the same slow, careful attention she has shown since our very first conversation. "I did not offer you certainty that day," she says, "only patience. I am glad it proved useful." I ask her whether her delegation intends to seek closer ties with Earth now that the conflict has concluded, given how many other species seem eager to do exactly that. She considers the question with characteristic care before answering. "My people do not rush toward new alliances simply because the wind has changed direction," she says. "We watched you before this conflict began. We will continue watching you now that it has ended. Trust, in my experience, is rarely built through a single dramatic moment, however significant. It is built through many quiet moments that follow it." I find her answer more meaningful than any of the eager trade proposals flooding toward our delegation from species who spent months mocking us without a second thought. There is something honest in her caution, something that reminds me that respect, earned through fear of consequence, is far more fragile than respect earned through consistent, demonstrated character over time. Before we part, she offers one final observation, delivered with the same quiet certainty that has marked every conversation we have shared. "You have proven what you are capable of when patience finally ends," she says. "The more important question now, Elena Ward, is what your species chooses to become once the fighting is truly finished. Strength revealed is only the beginning of a story. What follows matters a great deal more." Her words stay with me as I finally make my way toward the observation window, turning over the weight of what she has said, understanding that the true measure of everything we have accomplished will not be found in the terms of this peace agreement, but in how humanity chooses to carry itself across the many years that will follow it. I find myself standing near the same observation window where I once spent so many quiet, uncertain evenings during the months leading up to this conflict, watching the same stars that witnessed every step of this long, patient journey. Captain Daniel Cross joins me there, his posture more relaxed than I have ever seen it, the tension of months of careful strategy finally easing from his shoulders. "It's strange," I tell him, watching the distant lights of ships moving peacefully between docking stations. "Everything looks the same out there, but nothing about how this station feels is the same at all." "That's how real change usually works," he says, quietly, until suddenly it isn't quiet anymore. We stand together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the slow, steady movement of ships beyond the glass, before Ambassador Grace Milton finds us there, her formal duties for the day finally concluded. She looks lighter than I have seen her in months, though the exhaustion of everything she has carried still shows faintly around her eyes. "I wanted to thank you both," she says, joining us at the window. "None of this would have unfolded the way it did without steady people willing to hold their positions during the uncertain months before anyone understood the full picture." I tell her that I spent most of those months feeling more confused than steady, uncertain what my role even was, while so much happened just beyond my understanding. She smiles, the first truly relaxed smile I have seen from her since we first met. "Confusion and steadiness are not opposites, Elena," she says. "You kept doing your work carefully, honestly, without panic, even when you had every reason to feel lost. That is exactly what steadiness looks like from the inside. It rarely feels the way people expect it to feel." I think about that for a long moment, turning her words over the way I once turned over Owen Blake's careful instructions, the way I turned over the Venn representative's quiet warnings on the garden platform. So much of this entire journey, I realize, was built from people simply doing their small part honestly, trusting that those small parts would eventually connect into something larger than any one of us could see clearly at the time. Grace excuses herself shortly after, called away to another round of negotiations with delegations eager to secure new agreements before the political landscape shifts any further. Before she leaves, she pauses and looks back at me one final time. "There will be more moments like this one," she says, "not always this dramatic, but moments where patience is tested, where the temptation to react too quickly, or not at all, will both feel easier than doing the careful, difficult work of waiting for the right moment to act. I believe you understand that now in a way you did not before. Hold on to it. This council will need people who understand it, for a very long time to come." She disappears back into the crowded corridor, leaving Captain Cross and me alone once more at the window. He glances toward me with a small, knowing look. "She's not wrong, you know," he says. "This isn't really an ending, it's more like the closing of a very long first chapter." I ask him what he thinks the chapters after this one will hold. He considers the question honestly, without the easy confidence he might have offered months earlier, before either of us fully understood how much uncertainty accompanies even the most carefully laid plans. "I don't know," he admits, "but I trust that whatever comes, we'll face it the same way we faced this. Carefully, patiently, and when the moment finally calls for it, decisively." I think back to that very first session, to the speaker's mocking voice, calling humanity the retreating species, to the laughter that filled this chamber while I stood alone, humiliated, unable to defend the choices my own species had made. I think about Owen Blake's calm explanation of patient preparation, about Grace Milton's steady resolve throughout months of careful diplomatic maneuvering, about every quiet clue I gathered along the way without fully understanding what they meant until the moment they finally came together. I understand now, more completely than I ever could have during that first humiliating session, exactly what our patience had always been protecting. It was never fear that kept humanity from responding to every insult, every dismissal, every act of aggression along our borders. It was discipline, carefully maintained, waiting for the precise moment when action would matter more than words ever could. The Kael'thari speaker, who once mocked us so openly, has quietly resigned his position within the Compact's government, replaced by representatives eager to rebuild whatever trust remains possible after the events of these past months. I do not know what became of him personally, and I find I do not particularly need to know. His mockery, once so painful to endure in silence, has become nothing more than a distant memory, overshadowed entirely by everything that followed. As I take my new seat within the council chamber during the sessions that follow, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed, I carry with me a lesson I suspect will stay with me for the rest of my career within this vast, complicated galaxy of competing powers and shifting alliances. Strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, patiently, quietly, choosing its moment with the same careful precision my grandfather once described when he spoke, rarely and only when necessary, about the difficult decisions he carried throughout his own quiet service. The galaxy mistook our patience for weakness once. I do not believe that mistake will ever be made again. And as I look around this chamber, filled now with careful respect rather than careless mockery, I understand completely that this new understanding of humanity was never truly about proving anyone wrong. It was about finally being seen, fully and honestly, for exactly who we have always been,